Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Making Heat Reuse Work. This webinar is presented on behalf of a coalition of 4 stakeholders: EUDCA, the European Data Center Association; Eureat and Power, the European District Heating and Cooling Association; the Open Compute Project; and the Net Zero Innovation Hub for Data Centers. This is also the group of stakeholders behind the creation of the heat reuse platform, on which you will hear more about today. My name is Pauline Lucas. I am the Policy Director at Eureat and Power, and I am pleased to moderate this session today. I am joined by Joanne Garbutt, Sustainability and Government Engagement Director at Digital Realty, representing EUDCA; Noah Nkonge, Senior Manager, Sustainability Heat Export at Equinix, representing EUDCA; and Luca Neumann, Senior Policy Advisor at Eureat and Power. So while there is a vast potential and interest in reusing data center heat, the real question is, what does it take to make it work in practice? Successful projects depends on a broader set of conditions: availability of infrastructure, coordination between actors, and finding the right business case. In other words, a lot of planet needs to align, and that is exactly what we are here to explore today. So we will hear about both the district heating and cooling and the data center perspective, the commercial dimension of projects, and the role that the heat reuse platform can play in helping partners connect and move forward with heat reuse agreements. A quick practical point before we begin the webinar. Please use the Q&A box to submit your question. We will address them as many as possible during the Q&A session after the presentation. And the slides and the recording will be available on the Eureat and Power website, on EHP's YouTube channel, and later on the Heat Reuse Platform website. And with that, let's get started.
Heat reuse gets a lot of airtime in policy discussions, but there's often a gap between the rhetoric and the reality on the ground. Most people here will have heard the term, but few have actually been through the technical and commercial process that actually makes a heat reuse project happen. And that's what this webinar is trying to address. The Heat Reuse Platform, or HRP, is being built to provide practical tools that accelerate projects from concept to feasibility. And today is about establishing that shared baseline of understanding that helps us to work in the same direction together. The webinar is deliberately cross-sector. Heat reuse projects fail most often not because of a single technical problem, but because the parties involved are focusing on different aspects of the project and have fundamentally different constraints. So district heat operators think about reliable heat supply, and they think about capital investment cycles. Data center operators may be thinking about uptime and PUE and customer SLAs. While policymakers are focused on compliance frameworks, city planners may be trying to integrate infrastructure at scale. All 4 groups need to be in the room, and all 4 groups need a shared vocabulary for data center and district heat reuse projects, and that's what we're building today. So before we get into the detail, it's worth holding this picture of what success actually looks like. The projects that work are the ones where feasibility is tested rigorously before anyone commits capital. They're data-driven from the first conversation, not just from the first engineering report. And they're designed so that the data center operators are not put at risk for the points or the aspects of the project that are important to them. And critically, they produce a process that can be replicated. And one successful project should then make the next one easier. And that's the ambition behind the HRP.
Thank you, Joanne and Pauline, for this great introduction. And I will continue with sort of setting the scene of what waste heat reuse actually means. And then we'll also give you sort of a closer introspection into how district heating and cooling networks are thinking about it. So I'm probably stating the obvious, but put simply, heat reuse or waste heat recovery is the process of recovering thermal energy that would otherwise be wasted, and using this energy for heating buildings or industry through district heating and cooling systems. And technologically, it is very much possible. However, certain considerations need to be taken into account, and it's not just a plug and play project. One of the key considerations is the temperature range, and the seasonality of it. We need to consider the fact that the waste heat that is coming from data centers is usually at a temperature of 25 to 35 degrees, while most of the district heating and cooling networks in Europe operate on a temperature range from 70 to 90 degrees. Um, then when it comes to seasonality, of course, data centers need more cooling in summer while they need less cooling in winter, which of course has an impact on the amount and the availability of waste heat for district heating and cooling networks. We also need to consider what type of technology is used to cool servers in data centers. And I'm sure that my colleague Noah will come back to that because it's about liquid cooling versus air cooling. This has an impact again on the amount of waste heat and also the temperature quality of that. And then, of course, the question that project partners have to ask themselves, what kind of infrastructure is necessary? Most often, we might need to upgrade the waste heat from data centers. And for that, we need to build large-scale heat pumps, but of course, also heat exchangers and the piping system. And finally, we also, as with any energy system, need to consider potential heat losses, but also the system efficiency impacts that are linked to the local conditions, let's say, on the ground. So uh, while I said that technologically it's really not such a challenge, of course, the devil is sort of in the detail. And that's where the scale up of heat reuse processes faces sometimes significant barriers and challenges. But these are more of commercial, administrative nature. And to give you just a few, I wanted to start with one, which is the obvious fragmentation of ownership. We have to deal with several actors, the data center operator, the district heating and cooling operator, but also the municipality, with who all have different responsibilities and also sometimes different objectives. And so these need to sort of be aligned first. And sometimes you also have a fourth actor that is being involved, and that's a financial institution, because you need to consider, of course, the significant financial side of the waste heat recovery. And speaking of financials, there's also something that we need to consider with regard to CapEx and OpEx. And this is a huge challenge at times because if we talk about installing necessary infrastructure such as large-scale heat pumps, we talk about significant investments. And then quickly the question arises between partners, who will actually cover these costs? And then once you have gotten over this step, you get to the OpEx side where when you talk about large scale heat pumps, they need electricity. And so there's the question like, who is covering the cost for this electricity? And as we know, and as it's discussed in media every day, electricity and energy prices in the EU are pretty high. So this is also something that needs to be addressed. And then we're coming sort of to the planning aspect. Installing a large-scale heat pump or other transfer equipment needs space and therefore permitting, which is in the remit of municipalities. And as we all know, from a practitioner side, permitting is always not always that straightforward. There might be also different permitting rules, depending on whether you're a data center operator or district heating or cooling operator. And for the operator in the end of the heat pump, for instance, there's also the question of access to the electricity grid. So lots of things that need to be considered when it comes to planning. And one of the big challenges from a district heating operator's perspective is that heat and electricity planning are often not thought together, which further complicates things. And then finally, another challenge is, of course, proximity from a geographical point of view. The further the data center is away from a potential heat network, well, the more it might cost to create this connection, and maybe you might also have more heat losses depending on the distance. So these are elements that you need to consider. So let's try to dive a little bit deeper into the district heating network perspective. So on these slides, there are several elements that we already mentioned, but I think the key here is, and Joanne already referred to it, is that we're dealing with sort of, on the one hand, at least from district heating network perspective, a with a variable supply, which depends on the IT load, the usage of the servers in the data centers. And this, of course, for a heat network is a challenge because they need to continue to deliver reliable and predictable heat to their customers without any change. And additionally, um, from an economic perspective, district heating networks need to sort of be able to justify the investments that go together with a waste heat recovery project. And there's often this time frame, this difference of a time frame between data centers and district heating network operators, considering that district heating networks need 10 to 15 years often to recover their investments. So this is quite a challenge and a priority for us, but we totally think that it's worth it, considering that a study from the University of Aalborg projects that there will be a potential of 200 terawatt hours of waste heat potential from data centers, and this will be part of a significant share of the future district heating network energy use through waste heat. And with that, of course, and to make this potential sort of like a reality, we need to have a look also at the policy and regulatory context. We have already quite a strong framework in place at the EU level with the Energy Efficiency Directive, um, obliging data centers to report on waste heat availability, to also make it sort of available to district heating and cooling networks. There's also strong recognition of waste heat in the decarbonization process of district heating and cooling networks. And sort of looking ahead, what we've seen in the last year is that the Commission is really pushing this topic forward, seeking to unlock 11% of the heat demand with waste heat recovery. But we're also going to have, end of May, a publication of the data center energy efficiency package, which will contain for sure certain provisions on a waste heat recovery from data centers. And just last week, actually, on Thursday, the Commission published a draft delegated act for the establishment of a common union rating scheme for data centers, introducing, among others, a criterion for waste reuse readiness of data centers. So this item or this topic will stay on the top of the agenda. Just very quickly, some suggestions also from the district heating and cooling side with regard to the policy framework that is needed to allow the scale up of waste heat recovery projects. Of course, modernize district heating and cooling networks in order for them to more efficiently integrate the low temperature waste heat from data centers. But of course, also develop district heating and cooling networks because they're the only energy infrastructure that actually are able to use waste heat. I already talked about the planning aspect, so this is really something crucial that needs to be addressed. Think of the energy system as an integrated system. We need to talk about, of course, about the de-risking of let's say, the first steps of bringing data centers and networks together so that they're willing to sort of engage in this process and make the first steps and build the infrastructure. On a purely practical side, we also think that the promotion of the use of template contracts, and I'm sure we're gonna get back to that as well later on, can be helpful to sort of help with the kickoff from the commercial side. And then finally, let's also think about the way how we could potentially incentivize data centers to offer their waste heat, um, be it through certain sustainability labels or whatever you can imagine to make it also interesting to actually do these operations. And with that, I would like to hand over to Noah for his section.
Thank you, Luca, for that comprehensive overview of the perspective from the heat network operator's perspective. I'm now going to talk more from the data center operator's perspective on waste heat reuse. There's going to be some similarities to what Luca shared, but I think it is good to reinforce the main messages, but also some differences that are particular to the viewpoint of data centers. So, firstly, I'm just going to recap on what data center heat reuse looks like, and maybe just focus more on just at the front end of the data center. So, basically, when data centers power their customers' IT equipment, this generates heat, and normally this heat will be rejected to the atmosphere. However, with heat reuse, this heat is captured and transferred to pipework within the data center and then put through a heat exchanger where it's transferred to a third party, such as a heat network operator. Important point is that most data center operators are not looking to become heat utilities. So, as generally speaking, we're really happy to provide the heat to a third party like a heat network operator. Um, so that's just a really important point to bear in mind. And so when we transfer it over to the heat network operator, it's usually at about 30 degrees Celsius. And oftentimes, therefore, what's needed is a heat pump to raise that temperature up to circa 90 degrees Celsius, at which point it can be then pumped via underground pipework into the community where homes, offices, swimming pools, etc., can be heated up. So heat reuse has really moved from being sort of a nice to have, something that you do, if you've got the time and willingness, to something that's really a strategic imperative. There's three main reasons why I want to highlight this. One of them is regulations. Luca already talked about the Energy Efficiency Directive, which for communities and heat network operators filters down into decarbonization targets for heat networks. And on the side of the data centers, we have this transposition of the Energy Efficiency Directive. So at the EU level, there's policy set out that sets out what member states have to do, and then the member states have to put the detail in themselves. Germany already did that last year, and France has recently transposed the directive as well, requiring both new and existing data centers to carry out feasibility studies to show if they're capable of exporting heat as a minimum. And Spain has also drafted its transposition, and many other countries are to follow. So doing heat reuse is really helps the data center industry keep ahead of regulations. Second point, really important, efficient use of resources. For heat networks, we have the reduction in price volatility, improved energy security, and then on the data center side, yes, there's going to be increased growth due to AI of data centers. Growth in data centers means growth in amount of heat available. And so this is an opportunity to reuse that heat. Of course, we need to consider different things like where these data centers are located, and as Luca said, proximity, etc. But it is an important opportunity with AI that has raised a lot of attention. So now people are a lot more aware of data centers and the resources that they can provide to the local community. And there's also a benefit from a data center of doing heat reuse, because for every unit of heat exported to the community means one less unit of cooling that needs to be generated by the data center. So there are energy savings there. And then last but not least, creating a circular economy. Reusing data center waste heat is about using locally generated resources for the benefit of the local community. And this can have knock-on effects like job creation, for example, in the building of new heat networks. So that's why the topic of heat reuse from data centers is now strategically important, both for the heat network sector, but also the data center sector. So what are these key ingredients? So a number of planets really have to align. I won't go into lots of detail because Luca already covered quite a bit of things. But top line, there needs to be sort of technically, do the two systems match up? So, for example, are the temperatures that the data center operates at, will those temperatures work for the heat network operator? That's one thing. Another really important one is partners. Data centers cannot do heat reuse alone. We need to work with partners. Those are heat network operators principally, but then also the cities and municipalities also have a key role to play in terms of bringing stakeholders together as well. A third important point is around heat networks. Generally, it's easier if there's an existing heat network to plug into, or next best thing is if there's a planned one. But if there's no plans, and we're sort of starting from scratch, then that's going to take the longest time for a project to develop. And then last but not least is the economics. And what it boils down to is the economics have to work for the data center operator and the economics have to work for the heat network operator. On the data center operator side, as I said before, the data centers are not looking to generate a new revenue stream for heat reuse. We want to do this because it's the right thing to do for the communities where we operate. However, we do want to recover the investment that we'll need to put in to the infrastructure, because that can be anywhere in the range of 1 to 5 million euros to put in the required infrastructure for this. And then, yeah, and then ultimately the heat network operators have to sell the heat to end customers. And it really comes down to, given the economics of the scheme, will there be an affordable cost of heat to the end customer? And as a rule of thumb, different studies have showed that generally we need to have about 1.5 gigawatt hours per kilometer per year of linear heat density for a project to be viable. And that takes into account the variables of distance, distance between data center um, and the heat consumers, the heat density, etc. So those are some of the key ingredients of making a successful project. Here's an example. This is like indicative, so it will vary by specifics of data center, but this is an example of how many equivalent homes can be heated from a data center. Take an example of a data center that has 25 megawatts, designed for 25 megawatts of IT load. Um, and importantly, um, I've put there's 15% heat export fraction. What that means is of the total amount of heat that the data center could export, about 15% could be used because you've got to take into account things like seasonality of when this is happening and the needs of the heat network and the community, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and so the estimate is that about 3,000 homes could be heated, the equivalent of from a 25 megawatt data center. And that just gives you sort of a sense of scale, hopefully. Yeah, so just recapping again on some of the key considerations, some of which I've already covered. Um, we've talked about water-cooled versus air-cooled data centers. So a lot of older data centers will literally, yeah, will use air cooling systems to reject heat to the atmosphere, whereas a lot of modern ones will use water-cooled systems, which basically means using water to take heat from the server rooms and then reject it in the cooling system. Um, and then key commercial considerations really is that, as I mentioned before, data center operators don't want to be a heat utility. Um, most times, data center operators don't want to operate the heat pump to upgrade that heat to the temperature that the heat network needs it in, because that's not the core business of a data center. The core business of a data center is providing our customers with power and cooling their server equipment. And then also relating to not wanting to be a heat utility, data center operators generally do not want to provide guarantees of the heat because the amount of heat that a data center can provide is depends on the use of IT equipment by our customers, and we can't make our customers use their IT equipment more or less. It's really up to them. So that's why data centers do not generally want to provide guarantees. And then, as Luca mentioned, we've got to balance also that, generally speaking, data center customer contracts are shorter than heat network operator contracts. So for a data center, it could be, 5, 10, 15 years, whereas a heat network operator generally wants contracts, 15, 20, maybe even 30 years. So what are the must-haves that are really important? Joanne already mentioned this. These are SLAs, or service level agreements, which basically means we need to ensure that we maintain the power and cooling to our customers. That's our first priority. It's the reason of being there. So doing a heat reuse project, that's the first thing that needs to be asked, is that will it have a detrimental impact on these SLAs? Another important thing is then we have to maintain the energy efficiency of the data center, especially with the regulations in the EU that are driving performance coming forward as well. And I would probably just add that, again, partners are really important for this, because we can't do this alone as data center operators. We need the heat networks, we need the cities as well. And yeah, just coming to the close, I'm just going to give you an overview here of some project development phases from sort of inception to operation. So if you've ever worked on an infrastructure project, or some sort of design project, this will be quite familiar. And on the left-hand side, it's really starting with high level technically, does it make sense? So checking temperatures, distances, etc., before doing a lot of work. And then going into feasibility assessment if all parties are happy that it looks like this has promise and potential, doing a feasibility assessment to understand the costs and the benefits. And then, as we move to the right, we move more from the technical into the commercial and financial. And that's when we get into memorandum of understanding, or heads of terms, which would essentially be an overview of the commercial arrangements and risk allocations, who does what. And then once everyone's happy with the commercials, generally moving into more detailed design, and then final investment decision, essentially, where both parties agree to do the project, at which point there'll also be a sort of binding contract signature. And once there's that contract signature, we then move into the construction and operation. So that's the general flow of the development of a project. Of course, it does vary from project to project, but that does give you an idea, hopefully. And now I'll pass back over to Joanne.
Thanks. So we've set the scene. We've understood the district heat network perspective, and we also heard from data center operators about their real-world constraints. So let's turn into what the heat reuse platform actually is designed to do about all of these items that were mentioned by my speaking colleagues. And how does it fit into the project lifecycle that Noah just put on the screen there? So in this particular case, we see that HRP operates across two dimensions. You got connection and you have execution. On the connection side, it's about getting the right parties talking. So you use proximity mapping to identify data center and district heat network pairs that are geographically and technically viable. And then providing a structured matchmaking process so those conversations can actually start and on a solid ground as well, on a solid ground basis. And on the execution side, it's about making feasibility faster and more consistent. The feasibility calculator provides a standardized financial model to work from in order to address level 2 that Noah had just talked about there. And there's templates and meeting guidance that helps to set up the prospects or the projects discussions between the two parties, so that the parties don't have to reinvent the wheel at every stage there. And the goal is to compress the early phases of projects significantly so that you reach the point of knowing this is a go, this is not a go faster, so you can pivot and look for other opportunities. If we go to the next slide. The project impact or the system impact that the HRP has is it's a way to think about the value of this project through 3 lenses. First of all, it reduces the things that waste time and money. So stranded heat is a waste. It was never going to reach any network until there is a potential for that. And projects that collapse after months of groundwork also would be reduced by the fact that you can faster move to that go, no-go discussion. And the expectations mismatches that derail negotiations before they've even properly started. That also gets reduced by having the templates and having the guidelines to work from. So it enables things that build confidence. So early stage assessment means that you know before you invest where things are going to land up. As I said, there's a feasibility calculator. There's a shared technical baseline, so everyone is aligned with what are we going to do, who's operating what, where is the space, and so forth. And you can have a clear red, amber, green system as well if you organize your project that way. So decisions are made on evidence, and you know when the evidence is come in, and if you have green lights or if you have a few red lights on data that's not available or not known. And it also improves the broader picture, ultimately. So you have better city-level coordination, you have a greater decarbonization impact, and a high project success rate that moves forward into making future projects easier to execute as well. And Noah mentioned, or I think it was Luca, the opportunity to have jobs on working on heat reuse projects, whether it's the installation of the integration or the actual extension of a heat network. That also builds local knowledge so that these kind of projects happen faster in the future. So in summary, there's 3 things to take away from today. First of all, heat reuse is not a peripheral sustainability initiative. It's a meaningful approach towards decarbonization heating across Europe. Secondly, the regulatory direction of travel is very clear. The EU Energy Efficiency Directive and national frameworks and increasingly are treating heat reuse as a requirement, not as an option. And so thirdly, the reason more projects aren't happening isn't because there isn't a lack of interest. It's a lack of the right tools and structured processes to bring parties together effectively, sooner and faster. And that's exactly the gap that the HRP project is designed to close. We're covering more heat reuse themes across future webinars going forward. And we thank you for being with us today and hope to see you at future webinars too.